But first, for a government that was at pre-election pains to stress that all it wanted to do was change the Prime Minister, the Albanese government just gets more and more radical. It's true that Labor has said that it's fully committed to the Uluru Statement from the Heart, but the only aspect of it that anyone's talked about prior to the election was this proposed voice to the Parliament, not the treaties between First Nations people and Australia, and the Makarrata Commission, the so-called Truth-Telling Commission that Statement from the Heart also demands. Now, despite the voice being increasingly mired in controversy about exactly what it might advise on and who might get that advice, what would be the impact of advice, and the precise extent to which the High Court might become involved in the ordinary business of government, well, there's now a new front opening. The Financial Review today reports that a process of truth-telling to assess past traumas and mistreatment will begin within weeks. And you know where this is going, don't you? Towards compensation and reparation payments over and above the $30 billion a year that taxpayers already spend on Indigenous programs. Even before the voice has been voted on, and regardless of the outcome of the referendum, it seems this government is determined to push on with the so-called truth-telling, as if we don't know already that the truth of our settlement here in Australia has had its downsides as well as its up. There were massacres, like the dreadful 1938 killing at Mile Creek in northwestern New South Wales. Up to around 30 Indigenous men, women and children were killed by a party of settlers, for which 7 perpetrators were subsequently hanged. White men hanged under the British rule of law. Now, I suspect school kids know all about the massacre, but I wonder how many know that justice was meted out. What about the British government's instructions to Captain Phillip to live in amity and kindness with the native people, and that Phillip's declaration that there can be no slavery in a free land? And the fact that hundreds of Indigenous men too volunteered to serve in our armed forces in the Great War, despite the legal disabilities they then suffered under. So let's tell the truth by all means, but let it be the whole truth, not a one-sided truth that dwells only on what went wrong rather than also what we got right. And let's not rewrite history to pretend that our country is worse than it is, especially if that's just to shame people into voting for the voice, regardless of all the unanswered questions about it. Now, today, one of our leading political commentators in this country, the Australian's Paul Kelly, well, he had some good advice for the Prime Minister and his government. He says, Paul Kelly, along with the well-known Jesuit lawyer Frank Brennan, that unless the government changes the model or seeks genuine bipartisanship in the Parliament, this referendum should be postponed. Kelly says that the public have been, quote, assailed by tricks and slogans. If you are suspicious, he says, about what's happening, your suspicions are justified. As currently proposed, Paul Kelly says the voice, and I quote, can advise on bills, existing laws, cultural norms, Australia Day, the history curriculum, sovereignty and treaty. It's time, he says, to end the fiction that this is just a modest, simple, nothing to see here goodwill provision that makes us a happier country. Says Paul Kelly, those claims are an intellectual fraud and a hoax on the Australian public. Without change, he says, the voice should be decisively voted down. Now, exactly right. Yet today at the National Press Club, again, the Prime Minister's trickery was on display.
I wanted to ask you, Prime Minister, to respond to critics who say it's been a failure of your government not to outline a preferred model on an Indigenous voice to Parliament at this stage in the debate, and whether you can clarify if you're willing to create and support funding for the yes and no cases in order to get the coalition on side.
On the latter, we're giving equal funding to the yes and no cases.
Through campaign entities?
We're giving equal funding of zero to both the yes and no cases.
Now, you know that equal funding is not true. There's a tax break for the yes campaign and nothing for the no. In addition, there's around $200 million plus for, amongst other things, a campaign to stop misinformation, which is code for stopping the no campaign from speaking out against the voice. When the Prime Minister has got the people of the likes of Paul Kelly calling him out, you know his voice is in trouble.